Good day, everyone. So I'm sorry again for the delay in chapter 1. I hope you guys have familiarized yourself with the chapter 2 that was posted whilst I was having some difficulties with some technical difficulties on my side. I'm Dr. Ndozini, and I'm going to be taking you through basic concepts of child and adolescent development, which is your chapter 1. So the learning outcomes for this chapter, after studying this chapter, you will have knowledge about the goals of child psychology, views on children through the ages, developmental stages and domains of development, issues in child development, some developmental theories, we'll discuss those, and I'll discuss those, and research in child development. Remember, if you've got questions, please post them on the discussion board and I will respond to them. Okay, so just an orientation. I'm not sure if you guys can say on the discussion board if you've read and give your opinion on the development of the monkey boy of KwaZulu-Natal and the boy who became the girl. I need you guys to just give me your input on the discussion board about this story. And I want to know from you guys which areas of development would you like to explore with regards to these stories, and really based on your own curiosity. So the goals of psychology, of child psychology rather, is to describe, to explain, to predict, and to improve based on the research and the knowledge that we know about children. So some views on children, and this is the historical overview. Ancient cultures speak about child property, children being the property of parents. That is in the ancient cultures, and some cultures, of course, we know that they still view children as properties of parents, and therefore parents can do whatever they like with the children. For if there are some of you here in the class that view your children that you may have as your property, we'll see what the Middle Ages cultures and the 21st century say about that. So the Middle Ages, children is a miniature adult, so they are pupils. I don't know if you guys remember the time when they were not called students, they were called pupils, so they are mini adults. That's a view that has also developed, and in the 17th century, with the help of the influence of John Locke, it's tabula rasa. So the children are not seen as property of parents, neither are they seen as mini adults, but it's a combination of everything. Children also have got their own personality, their own character. And in the 20th century, children initially had no rights. They had no rights. There was no Bill of Rights for children. Okay, so in the 20th century, children initially didn't have no rights. There was no Bill of Rights in most countries, especially in South Africa. The child in Africa and in South Africa, for example, some African countries, there's a big difference between how they view children and seeing children as individual entities that have got their own constitutional rights, and some African countries still having a traditional view or an old view of children. So we had the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the current state of children in South Africa. For example, one of the rights that you guys may know, children have a right to food, to schooling, to basic education. They have a right to shelter. They have a right to a mother. They have a right to a father. And that there's a whole lot of the Bill of Rights for children. So we're going to talk about the developmental stages and domains of development. So in terms of the developmental stages, we've got the prenatal stage, the neonatal stage, the early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescent. Okay, so let's just go back. Okay, it's like I'm not able to, but okay, we'll still go back to those. So the domains of legal definition of a child in South Africa is any person under the age of 18 years old. So that is a child. If there are children amongst you guys, maybe they are 16, 17, they finished their grade 12 when they were 15 years old, and they are 16 and they are 17, they are less than 18, then you are children at a university institution, and you are welcome. Even you, this is your space as well. So the legal definition of a child in South Africa is any person that is under the age of 18 years old. The domains of development: physical, we look at the physical development, we look at the cognitive development, we look at the personality development, look at the social development. For example, if you think of a child when they have to go to do their grade R, and depending whether you're going to a private school or a public school, those are some of the aspects that will give you to ascertain whether a child is ready for school or not. They look at the physical, the cognitive, through personality, through cognitive test or school readiness test, personality test as well, and also, is the child emotionally ready for school? So there are some issues in child development, such as the nurture versus the nature, or nature versus nurture. Nature is the natural, innate biological abilities. Can we use only that to explain child development, or does nurture, meaning the socialize, how we socialize and nurture children, explain developmental growth with children? Continuity versus discontinuity. What are some of the things that we continue to see when we are looking at the human development in general, and the human development in children in particular? The passive versus active involvement. Which children are passive, which children are active, in terms of the active involvement that parents give to their children. So do we have parents that are more actively involved or more passively involved, and how does that affect the growth of the kids? Universality versus cultural context. So when we try to understand children, can we use universal principles and universal theories to understand children, or do we look at children in terms of the individual cultural context that they are raised in, or that they go to school under, and so forth and so forth? Theories of development. What is a child in developmental theory? How do we understand a child in terms of the developmental theory? What is the function of a theory? Is a theory enough to understand why a children of 6 months is expected to behave in certain ways versus a child of 24 months, for example? So the following theoretical perspectives are discussed: the biological, the psychodynamic, the learning theory, the cognitive developmental, the contextual, and the Africa. So the biological theory is the innate capability. So a child development biologically in certain ways, their brain development. The psychodynamic theory is it looks at the early exposure that the child had with regards to their parents. How was the child treated? Was the child breastfed? What happened when the child was being potty trained? Was the immediate or primary guardian too strict or not strict? All those dynamics have got an influence on how the child is going to develop. The learning theory looks at the social context, and do children develop through learning? What happens in their environment? And can we explain that in trying to understand the theory? Cognitive developmental, in terms of it looks at we
we will, psychologists use assessments, for example, to look at cognitive development. The contextual, in what context was the child raised? We can also sort of, it overlaps with the African context, to see how does the context that the child is raised influence the child. Okay, if we look at the biological perspective, which was the first one that was listed, maturational theory, which was developed by Arnold Gesell, and it's based on a theoretical assumption that when children mature, then they start to make better decisions. And the ethological theory, it's also a theoretical assumption, and it was developed by Konrad Lorenz. And then the most famous one is the evolutionary theory by Charles Darwin. And some of the theoretical assumptions for this theory are that all of us, we evolved from apes, and as we evolved, we become better, more intelligent, and we have shorter hands and more human-like features. And as more as the evolution takes place, we lose the features, the animalistic features that we had. Okay, some of the support for the biological perspective is there's an interest in the physiological psychology, neuropsychology, where we look at the nervous system and the neurological system of children to explain certain behaviors, to explain certain behaviors. And then psycho and endocrinology also explains certain behaviors. So there's a lot of support for biological perspective. If we look at Sigmund Freud, that's the psychodynamic theory or perspective, where it talks about everything that is done within the first 6 years of life of a child will have a bearing on the personality of the child and on how the character of the child or of the person as a whole developed. So Sigmund Freud looks at everything. Breastfeeding, what happened? Was the child breastfed? How was the child breastfed? In terms of potty training, responding to the child's needs, all those kinds of activities have a bearing on the personality of the child, be it the child will be too soft and or too hard, or if there's too much nurturing, over nurturing, the child may be very clumsy in terms of how they do things, and so there's a bearing on that. So the perspective, Freud's psychosexual theory, some of the theoretical assumptions there are just what I said earlier, that psychosexual development of a child, there's a fixation on every stage, and if that crisis is not resolved for a specific child, then it may have a bearing on what kind of an adult that person would be. So in terms of the structure of the personality, when we again looking at the psychodynamic perspective, we've got the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is that structure of the personality where it's like a child. It wants instant gratification, it cannot wait, doesn't have patience. And the ego is almost like then the superego is the strict structure where it's guided by rules. What do the rules say? Is this right or wrong? There's a moral sort of a connotation to whether something is done or not. And the ego is sort of like the balance between the child, which is the id, and the parent, which is the superego, or the policeman, or the judge, which is the law. So the ego is almost like the police, if you like that narrative. So in terms of psychosocial development, there are zones of development, impetus for development, and there are problematic developmental stages, especially if the crises are not resolved.
So the 5 psychosocial development stages are oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, and genital stage. The oral stage is when the child is breastfed. Everything is they are fed through breastfeeding, and that's the stage. The anal stage is the potty training stage, where children are potty trained. So the phallic stage of development, that's the 3rd stage of psychosocial development according to Freud, and it begins at around 3 years old, where the focal point of the body is the genitalia, be it the penis or the vagina, and where the child learns that they can derive pleasure from manipulating their body. So those of you who've got 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, you will notice that it's the time that they like to play with their. And then we've got the the 4th stage, which is the latency stage, and this stage is it's the 4th stage of psychosocial development. It spans from around age 6 years old to puberty. And during this stage, libido is dominant, and just looking at my notes, and no further psychosocial development takes place after this. So it's the libido of the child from the time they are 6. They forget about those. There's no focal area on that. So what Freud thought is that most sexual impulses are repressed during the latent stage, and sexual energy can be sublimated towards schoolwork, hobbies, and friends. So most children at that age, they really have a big focus on their friends, and they're not playing with their private parts as much. And then we've got the genital stage, and this is the last stage of Freud's psychosocial theory of personality development, and it begins in puberty. It's a time of adolescent sexual experimentation. So this is the time that sexual instincts is directed to heterosexual pleasure rather than self-pleasure. So this is the time that maybe they are playing with boyfriends and girlfriends, and there's an exploration of one's of one being a sexual being. And of course, because of the time that Sigmund Freud wrote in, there was a focus on heterosexual explorations. We now know that some adolescents also explore in terms of other feelings, of feeling attracted sexually towards the same-sexed person, and another girl if you're a lady, and another gentleman or another boy if you're a boy, or if you're a gentleman. So that all happens in the genital stage. Of course, Sigmund Freud's theory evolved, and there are some things that he changed some perspective. Well, not him, but the psychodynamic perspective just had changed. So just in brief, the oral stage is the sexual energy, where the mouth is the gratification. So the child gets gratification through the mouth. If problems, they suck their thumbs, they bite their nails, they later. If that stage was not thoroughly dealt with, you may find people who are smoking, they like to put things on their mouth. Your generation probably they use Hubblies a lot, so that may explain that maybe there was a fixation on the oral stage, or not. Maybe someone just likes smoking. And then the anal stage is between 1 to 3 years, where there's the sexual energy and they like to play a lot with themselves. The the anal stage is the toilet training, and if parents want child to learn before they are ready, or have too many demands, it could lead to extreme order or extreme disorder. Then the phallic stage from 3 to 6, that's when the sexual energy is there, and there's a lot of concentration and a lot of playing with their genitalia. From 6 to 11, the sexual instincts are repressed, and they just learn social values and how to play with friends and just all those kinds of things. And then the genital, there's adolescence, sexual impulses, that's sexually acceptable, mature sexuality. Sometimes people get married at this stage, or they find love and they decide to settle down with one person that they connected with. And then we have Erik Erikson, who did the psychosexual stages. So Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory, the African section is just a plus, but it's not compulsory that it should be there at all. The Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory, we're going to deal with the theoretical assumption of the theory, the normal and parametric development, and the 8 stages. His stages were 8. So his first stage was the basic trust versus mistrust instinct, or stage, where children learn whether they should trust their environment or not trust the environment. Autonomy versus shame and doubt, where children now need to learn how to be confident in the decisions that they make. Industry versus inferiority is around the school time, where children now need to master some industry skills, be it at work, at school, when they're doing their academic work. Identity versus identity confusion, intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy, that would be sort of related to Freud's last stage of development. Then there's the generativity versus stagnation when we're much older. Integrity versus despair. And then also his theory somewhat evolved, but we're just going to focus on those two in terms of the psychodynamic theory, Erikson's stages and Freud's stages of development. And now if we look at the third aspect, the learning theory perspective. Early learning theories are Watson, the behaviorist. So he looked at behavior, classic condition by Pavlov, and operant conditioning by Skinner. These fall under the learning theory perspectives. The social cognitive theory, which was propagated by Bandura, where he spoke about imitation, modeling, observational learning, self-efficacy. Okay, let's go to Piaget's theory, which is the fourth aspect, which is the cognitive developmental perspective. Here, the processes and principles of development is on schemas and organization and adaptation. He used a rat just to develop his theory on organization and adaptation and schemas and assimilation, and whether someone is conditioned or not, and accommodation and equilibration. So Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So he talked about the sensory motor stage, and this is from birth through to ages of between 18 and 24 months. And pre-operational stage, that's the toddler stage, 18 to 24 months, through early childhood, so maybe around age 7. The concrete operational stage, that's 7 to 11. The formal operational, that's adolescent right through to adult. So basically, Piaget's cognitive theory of development suggests that children move through 4 stages of development through their internal life, or through from the time they are born right up until they are adults. And his theory focuses not only on understanding how children acquire knowledge,
but also on understanding the nature of intelligence. And I've just mentioned the stages. So sensory from birth to about 18 months, pre-operational from about 18 months to about 7 years old, concrete operational from 7 years old to about 11, and the formal operational is from 11 onwards. So some of the components of his theory, he talked about the sensory memory that children learn through their senses, the short-term memory and the long-term memory. Obviously, for children who are in the first two stages, maybe their long-term memory may not be great, but their short-term memory and obviously their sensory memory may be more developed because of the age that they are in. And then the contextual perspective, theoretical assumptions of the contextual approach. So we're going to speak about Vygotsky's social cultural theory and the zone of proximal development according to Vygotsky. So basically, the best way to explain before we go to Bronfenbrenner, the best way to describe Vygotsky's stages of development, or the zones of proximal development, and there's a chart. I wish I can share it, that explains it very well. So the stage 1 is learning with guided assistance and scaffolding, where children learn through watching and being guided by their parents. Then step 2 is where they need less assistance with learning, and they really want to start learning to do things their own. And then the step 3 is independent learning, and step 4 is just when they feel like they've mastered their crafts. Okay, so we move on to Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory and the interactive systems, where he speaks about the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystems in terms of ecological development. And with the influence of time, the chronosystems. So if on the microsystem, here's another beautiful chart that explains. So the child is with the mom and the dad, and it's just that constellation of the nuclear family, if you like. It's in the house, and that's just with the immediate system of the child. Then on the mesosystem, it's daycare, maybe they've got friends, they've got school, the child is playing tennis, and sometimes belongs to that group of mesosystem. And then we've got the ecosystem, where it's a bit larger. The child is at school, they start to develop networks, and they may start to go to work, and so there's the workplace, social networks that are being local government, they join the government, if they're at university, they're part of the SR system, they're part of different committees. So that's the exosystem. And then the bigger system, the macro system, is the wider culture. So you are a South African, maybe an African as well. You belong to that community. You belong to the global community as well, which is still applicable very much as well today. And then, of course, we've got super and Harkness developmental niches, where they sort of look at the combination or the overlaps between physical and social environment, child rearing and child care practices, whether the child is being cared for at home or at school, psychological characteristics of the caregiver, and how do those influence how the children are
Then we've got the world view, the holistic perspective, where they look at everything: the caregiver, the characteristics of the child, the environment that the child grows up in, the kind of school that the child goes to, the biological perspective, the inherited aspects or characteristics that the child has and brings into his or her life, the hierarchical view, where they look at the hierarchy. Where is the child? Is it the firstborn? Is it the secondborn? Is it the thirdborn? And also just the hierarchy within the family and the structures that the child finds themselves in. The anthropocentric view, the spirituality view, where we look at the spiritual component and how it affects the child. The spirit of Ubuntu, where umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, I am because we are, or I am because you are, where it's this interconnectedness. It's a collectivist system. It's not a very selfish or individualistic system. Then we've got the collectivism, where we help each other and we shine together. There's no individual person who shines. And then we've got someone called Nsame Nang's theory. It's basically about the spiritual aspect of the person, and they believe that 3 phases of selfhood is the spiritual selfhood. I'm a spirit. I'm not just an individual. I'm not just this body. I've got a spiritual self. I've got a social self. There's a way that I am socially, and I've got an ancestral selfhood. I come from somewhere. That's something that goes through my blood stream, the genes of my ancestors, and all that aspects makes up a human being, including children. Okay, so let's go into the crux, the developmental stages. We've got the newborn, social priming, social apprenticeship, social entry, social internship, adulthood, old age, and death. Those are the stages. And then in terms of the big up, I don't have to explain those. I believe they are self-explanatory. And you can go to your textbook as well. A summary of the most important developmental perspective, the bigger picture. Which theory do you favor? Eclecticism, some people say it's a combination of everything. Others believe they want to use one view and one theory to understand children. Let's look at the research in child development. What is research? It's thorough investigation, active and systematic processes of trying to acquire knowledge, use of knowledge methods and guidelines, data analysis that we use when we're trying to do research, and conclusions and maybe recommendations. So there's different kinds of research. There's the quantitative research, qualitative research, and when we want to explore and understand children better, sometimes we use both methods and other people use one method. How do we gather information? Through observation, the naturalistic situations that the children are in. So if we're looking at children at daycare, that's their natural environment, or at home. And then there are structured environments where you give children certain tasks because you want to see them in a certain structure. That's observing behavior. Self-reports, it's doing questionnaires with children or with the caregivers. And then we of course have psychological tests, which are standardized. They have to have reliability, validity, and are normed according to the group that they are being tested on. So for example, if you want to see if your child is ready for school, we would use standardized school readiness tests and those kinds. General research designs that we have: experimental research, correlational research, case studies, meta-analysis. These are just different types of research designs. And the research designs for child development: longitudinal design, where we look at children from the time that they were born to the time that
maybe they were around 6 school going age and when they were adolescents, so we call that longitudinal. Cross-sectional designs is we look at children from different aspects. Maybe we're looking at different children in different contexts, and how they are at this age in that context, or racial, whatever, cultural context. And then sequential designs as well. We can also use sequential designs to research. Cross-cultural research in South Africa is very common and has been done, of course, because the context that we are in, we've got diverse languages and diverse cultures in South Africa. There are some challenges to cross-cultural design, such as, for example, with the test that I mentioned earlier, the standardized test. If they're not standardized to the norms of different racial connotations, for example, it could be a problem for the races or the cultures that maybe have been disadvantaged because they were not taken into account in terms of that culture that those kids belong to. Of course, in South Africa, we've got so many languages. So sometimes psychologists try to navigate through these problems through using culture-free tests, where maybe they use pictures, and there's more controversy around that as well. But you'll learn that more when you're doing your third year, or maybe your honors year. Research ethics. So some of the aims of research ethics with children is just to be guided by ethical guidelines. Some of the aims is to make sure that children are treated fairly and everything, their way of life, and they are normed accordingly, so they are not disadvantaged by tests or by some research that is being done. So this is guided by ethical guidelines. For example, when you do your research, you go through the university, but later when you guys are doing your masters, if you guys decide to take psychology to that level, you have to apply for ethical guidelines, especially if you're going to work with children, because they are regarded as a vulnerable group, children and the elderly. So there's very stringent rules in terms of how to go about getting ethical guidelines and ensuring that your research is actually ethical.